On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding as well. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him, "They don't have any wine." "What has this concern of yours to do with me, woman?" Jesus asked. "My hour has not yet come." "Do whatever he tells you," his mother told the servants. Now 6 stone water jars had been set there for Jewish purification. Each contained 20 or 30 gallons. "Fill the jars with water," Jesus told them. So they filled them to the brim. And then he said, "Now draw some out and take it to the head waiter." And when they did, when the head waiter tasted the water after it had become wine, he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. He called the groom and told him, "Everyone sets out the fine wine first, and then, after people are drunk, the inferior. But you have kept the fine wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there only a few days.
Yeah, so as most of you know, there is a big event starting very soon, probably in about 7 minutes. So if I see your phones out during the service, I know what's going on. That's okay if you want to check the score or whatever. I encourage you to just record it and then, don't listen to anybody after the service. Nobody tell each other the score, and we'll all go home and watch it. For me, don't tell me the score because I don't joke about that. If you make a joke about it, I'm dead serious. Are we good? Our sound's been a little funky. If I need to grab a handheld, just let me know and I'll do that. So I don't want to know the score, so I'm going to go home and watch it later. But as we think about the Super Bowl, right, it's really just an excuse to get together and throw a party for most people, right? To hang out, eat some wings, maybe drink a beer, find an excuse to celebrate, right? And if you think drinking a beer is wrong, just wait till we get into the meat of the text today. So, but with COVID this year, I know it's different, but normally it's just an excuse to throw a party. See, in our culture, we understand parties and celebrations, right? We find excuses all the time to party and celebrate, whether that be birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, Juneteenth, whatever, right? We celebrate sporting events at every level. We celebrate having a baby, getting married, buying a house, and basically everything under the sun. Even most people tonight aren't actually watching the Super Bowl because they care about the teams that are in it. It's just an excuse to party, right? And I don't think that's all bad. I think it's a good thing that we celebrate and that we party. But one thing that I want to point out and I want you to think about as we talk about celebration and party is, why do we party? What is the reason for our celebration? See, if we take time to think about it, every party actually has a reason behind it. We don't just celebrate for no reason. There's something behind or a cause behind the celebration. And why I think it's important for us to think about the reasons we celebrate is because that might be a clue into our value system. We might learn what it is that we find important in life. We might get a clue into the reasons we find joy. What is it in life that brings us happiness? And today in our text, I think it's very fitting. We're in John 2, verse 1 through 12. This has been planned a long time. We're not doing this because of the Super Bowl, but we're going to see about a party and a celebration. We're going to see that as we dive in, there's a reason for the celebration, and that is a wedding, but there's actually a much deeper cause for celebration and partying than just an earthly wedding, and we're going to see that through our time together today. For those of you who don't know me, like Kevin said, my name is Joel McCarty. I have the privilege of serving as one of the pastors here at New Eden Church, specifically as the pastor for preaching and oversight. I do want to thank you all for gathering with us as the people of God to corporately worship. It's encouraging to just sing together and come take communion together and pray together and come to the scriptures together. And if you're new, I especially want to welcome you into our midst. Our prayer is that you feel welcome, like Jesus welcomed us and made us feel welcome even when we were strangers. That's our hope as a church. And so like you heard read, our text today is from John chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. We're going to have the scripture on the screen for you. You can also follow along in your scripture notebooks. And if you have a Bible, you can find John in the New Testament. It's right after Matthew, Mark, and then Luke. So the fourth book of the New Testament. So in our time today, what we're going to do is we're going to simply walk through the narrative. We're going to see what the story has to show us at face value in its immediate context. And then we're going to dive deeper, kind of zoom out a little bit and see where the story fits in our broader historical narrative of the scriptures and see what that matters to us and how it impacts us in our time together today. So would it be easier if I grabbed a handheld, or let me do that? Kevin, do you have your handheld? Can I use that? We're just going to take a break for a second. This will be less distracting for me personally, so we'll see how this goes. All right, so let's immerse ourselves into the story. We're going to be in John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 is where we're going to start. So it says, on the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding as well. So last week, if you remember, John had just told us about some disciples of Jesus that had just begun to follow him. And so now John is going to move on from that to begin telling us about some what he calls signs or miracles that are proving that Jesus is who he says he is. These signs are going to affirm his message. And so now at this point in John, we've kind of gotten through the intro and we're diving into the thick of the story. And so it starts with this celebration. So in our story today, Jesus and his disciples and his mother are invited to this wedding. Now, the text doesn't tell us why they're invited. We don't know how close they were to the bride and groom, but for whatever reason, they are invited into this wedding celebration, and they chose to come. So a little bit of cultural context here. When we think of weddings, we typically think of at most maybe a day event where everybody is invited, right? You might have a time where people get together and they, get together maybe a little bit early, maybe the bridal party, but people come together, they see the wedding ceremony, and then maybe have a few hours of reception where people, dance, party, do whatever, take some pictures, all that, but no more than a day typically. But in this culture, weddings were much different. Weddings were typically at least a week long. It was this entire feast and celebration and party. And typically, the groom would be responsible for setting up the feast. We know for sure at least the wine that was brought to the party, probably the food as well. And so they would party for this whole week. They would drink good wine, they would dance, and they would celebrate this union between husband and wife. And just like today, there were cultural expectations that went along with the wedding, right? We know who's supposed to pay for the wedding. We know who's supposed to pay for the meal at the reception, right? And figure out all these cultural expectations. Well, the same thing was in this culture. And like I said, one of the main ones relevant to our story was that the groom and his family were supposed to provide wine for the celebration. History tells us that this was taken very seriously in this culture. If they ran out of wine at the wedding, it wasn't just some ho-hum thing like, sorry, somebody go grab some beer. Like it wasn't that accessible down the street. That's not how it worked. This was a big deal. At best, the groom and his family would be seen and they would be shamed. They would be seen as inadequate, maybe poor. Everybody would have been talking about them. This wedding would have not been something that people talked well about. That's like best case scenario. Worst case scenario, we see some evidence that scholars tell us sometimes they would actually sue the groom and his family and be like, hey, we brought the gifts like we were supposed to, and so we want reparations for what you were supposed to do, and you didn't bring the wine. They came there to party. That's why they were there, most of them. And so this was a serious thing. And so if we understand all this kind of sets us up for the rest of the story. Look at verse 3. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him they don't have any wine. So she would have been frantic. Jesus replies, what has this concern of yours to do with me, woman? Jesus asked, my hour has not yet come. Do whatever he tells you, his mother told the servants. So the wine runs out at the wedding, and for whatever reason, this is a concern to Mary. We don't know if she knew the groom, maybe she knew the groom's family, maybe she was a part of helping to serve the wine, and that was her role. But for whatever reason, she's concerned about this, and she comes to her son, Jesus, and she tells him that they don't have any wine. Now, at this point, Jesus hasn't began his public ministry of miracles. So we don't know that Mary assumed for him to do a miracle. Probably not. But she had probably learned that her son was a little different. She had an angel announce his birth. She at least trusted in his resourcefulness that maybe he could do something. You know, sometimes you go to someone and you know they might not have the answer, but you know they'll find somebody who does and they'll find a way to get it done. She at least knew Jesus in this light. And so she comes to him and says, hey, they've run out of wine. Now, he responds here in a way that seems harsh with our English language. Maybe you heard Kevin read it and you're like, dang, I thought Jesus was like perfect and supposed to be respectful to his mother all the time. And he's calling her woman, right? In our context, if we hear someone call someone a woman directly, like not about them, but to them, like, hey, woman, like that's never, like I even say that and I'm afraid like something's bad's going to happen. But we understand that's normally not done in a positive light. The reason why this word is so interesting is because it's tough to translate in English. Probably the closest word we have is like ma'am, where it can be used in a positive, endearing light, but not necessarily. And it can also be used maybe in a more terse, firm manner. It definitely wasn't the word mother, as we'll see. And so this wasn't a demeaning statement. Jesus actually used the same word woman to refer to his mother when he's on the cross and he asked John, the author of our book, to take care of her and make sure that she was cared for after he died. And so it was not always, again, a terse thing, but it could be. What we do know is that Jesus doesn't use what would have been the most natural language here, which was that of mother. It would have been most natural for him to say, mother, what does this, your concern have to do with me? And I think we need to get out of this is that Jesus is beginning to relate to Mary as more than just his mother. And Mary is beginning to relate to Jesus not just as her son, but as God's son, which is more important. The context of this story hints at that too. It's the very first of Jesus's public signs. So he's beginning to move into a role that's always been his. He's always been the Son of God, but that kind of public-facing ministry of it. And so Jesus distances himself from Mary's whims with his response. What does this concern of yours have to do with me? My hour is not yet come. Now, again, this can seem a little harsh, as if Jesus doesn't care about what his mother cares about, but that's not what's going on. We learn that from the statement, my hour has not yet come. Now, we don't have time to look at all of the times this is used in the Gospel of John, but we're going to see this used a number of times, this hour of Jesus. And what it refers to is not just a physical hour, it's like the time of Jesus, and it's referring specifically to his cross and his resurrection, to the time when he's going to be, more specifically, the cross, where he's going to walk to the cross, be beaten and be tried and be crucified. And see, the thing is that Jesus knows when he goes public with this message, that that's the natural result. That's what's going to happen, because his message is so radical that it comes into conflict with things of this age and the religious system that had been set up by the religious leaders. And so he knew it was going to lead to him being crucified. And so the point he's making here is Jesus wants to make sure that that is done in his heavenly Father's timing, not his earthly mother's. So Jesus responds to his mother, letting her know that it's not time for him to go public yet. But I love what Mary does. She doesn't just let it go and be like, okay, sorry, I asked you, right? She turns to the servants, so they're probably standing in this back kitchen area or something, having this conversation. And she turns to the servants, and instead of just letting it go, she says, do whatever he tells you to do. So she doesn't even continue the conversation with Jesus. She turns to the servant, and then she just entrusts him to do what he thinks is best. And she just lets it go. We don't see her in the story anymore. She walks out of there and lets Jesus handle it. And apparently this worked, because the next thing we see is Jesus moves to action. Now, this causes us to ask, if you're like me, would Jesus have turned the water into wine if Mary hadn't asked? And to be honest, I don't know, and I don't care, right? What I do know is that simply because she did ask and because she trusted him, that she got to play a part and participate in the first miracle that Jesus does to prove himself as Messiah. And I mean, isn't that what a big piece of talking to God and communing with him is anyways? Him inviting us into what he's doing in the world, which is an incredible grace that we get to play a part and maybe even get a little bit of credit when we know it's ultimately not us because God is sovereign over this. And so God's sovereignty and our involvement in his plans in the scriptures exist perfectly next to each other. And maybe our human brains can't wrap our minds around this. And let me encourage you, don't try to resolve the tension because the tension is what keeps you dependent on God and not ourselves. And so Mary tells the servants, do whatever Jesus tells you. And then she leaves and Jesus starts giving instructions to the servants. He says, hey, you got 6 stone water jars over here. I want you to grab those, and they've been set aside for Jewish purification rituals. And I want you to grab those and fill those to the top with water. So these were stone jars. They were used instead of clay jars because no dirt would get into the water. And this was the custom under the old covenant for people to purify themselves under the Jewish rituals. And so he tells them to grab the jars, fill them to the top with water, which the text makes clear would have been a total of about 120 to 180 gallons of water total. So it's a lot of water. Now, if you're like me, you can't really maybe fathom that. So I was looking this up. And so this is kind of a weird comparison, but I think it'll make sense. An average human uses about 30 gallons of water to take a bath in. Okay. So about 5 times that amount is how much water is in these 6 jars. It's a lot of water. And so he tells them to take some water out of the jars and take it to the head waiter. Now, the head waiter, some translations say master of the feast. It was basically a person that was there to make sure everything went smooth so the groom could be with the family and do, the stuff that he's supposed to do at his own wedding, right? And so the head waiter probably at this point knows this is a problem as well. He might even be frantically running around trying to figure out what to do. He knows it's ultimately the groom's responsibility, but he's still wanting to do something about it, probably. And so the servants obey Jesus. They bring the water from these stone jars. They might have thought it was crazy. We're not really told when the water turned to wine, but we know that when they drew the water out and gave it to the head waiter, when he went to drink it, it had turned into wine. So the water molecules had transformed into whatever forms wine. Maybe you know how that works. I don't. But anyways, we know that it happened sometime between when they told them to draw the water out and when they gave it to the headmaster. Now, we're not told much about these servants here, but I think it's important that we notice that John points out that they knew how the water got turned into wine. The headmaster didn't. The important people at the feast, the groom, these people had no idea. But the servants, the least at this party, got a glimpse and got insight into what Jesus was doing. And it's a common theme in the Gospels that Jesus highlights the faith of the least likely people in his stories. In this culture, sometimes the women or the children are these outcasts, and he's intentional with this. He doesn't use the elite or the powerful most of the time. Normally, it's the everyday, the unimportant people that Jesus uses. And in this story, at the wedding, the servants and his mother and his new disciples were probably the least important people at this party, and they get a glimpse into the glory of God on display simply because they trusted Jesus. And so the head waiter gets a taste of this wine and he's shocked in a very good way. Look at John 2, verse 10. He tells the groom this. So he runs to the groom. He assumes that maybe the groom set all this up. And so he says, hey man, everyone sets out the fine wine first, like the good stuff. Then after people are drunk, the inferior. But you have kept the fine wine until now. And so here the headmaster shares what normally the custom was, because he's surprised that the groom would do it differently. So normal custom is that you would start your party off with like the best wine you have to offer, the most expensive stuff. And then to save money as the week went on, as people kind of settled into the party, and what they say here is people actually got drunk, okay? And we're not saying it's okay to get drunk. We'll talk about that in a second. What he's saying, this is normally what happened. And so then they would bring out the diluted stuff, the cheap stuff, the stuff you got on sale at the clearance rack because it's old and going out. And so, you see that here. This is what normally happened, but not in this case. Jesus, the stuff he brought was the best stuff this guy had ever tasted, which makes sense. It's Jesus making it. And so because of this statement here, we know that this was actual wine, this statement about them being drunk. I'm going to make a little sidebar here. It's not really super relevant to the text, but I think it's important because of the culture we live in. This is not unfermented grape juice, as I was taught growing up. Jesus probably wouldn't have been allowed to work at most Baptist churches because not only did he participate in drinking wine, we know for sure he facilitated the drinking of wine with others, right? When I was working my way through a Bible college, I waited tables. And one of the rules was we couldn't wait tables at anywhere that served wine because we would be partaking in the sin of drinking wine or alcohol. And so Cracker Barrel and IHOP were the two places we could go work. So we all knew that's where you go work. Now, I don't know if you saw Cracker Barrel is beginning to serve alcohol. So that's happening. But anyways, so maybe that's, some people think that's a sign of the world going to hell in a handbasket, but whatever. So now Cracker Barrel isn't an option. But yeah, that's what I grew up believing. And so in this story, Jesus didn't just serve the wine, he created it and he gave it away for free and a bunch of it, okay? So I'm making a little bit of fun, but I do want to share a quick snapshot because I think it's important of what the Bible teaches about alcohol. So this is really quickly, if this is difficult for you to hear, we'd love to have further conversations about this. But let me just say quickly, the Bible never says that the use of alcohol in and of itself is a sin. Now, it does very clearly warn against the abuses of alcohol and being controlled by it. So the scriptures are clear that drunkenness is a sin. But like any good gift God gives us that can be abused, it can also be used in its proper and right context. And so what I want to say to us as a diverse body who might have different opinions on this is that as we engage with each other, we must be led by love of each other more than our love of enjoying good gifts from God. And so for you, maybe alcohol in the past has been abused in your life or you've seen it abused. And so your conscience leads you to believe that you shouldn't partake. And the scriptures are clear that for you, it would be sin to partake if that's where your conscience leads you. And those who don't feel that way, who feel they have the freedom to partake, should be willing to abstain when they are in the presence of others if it would be a stumbling block to them. And so if I am in the presence of someone that I know has struggled with the abuse of alcohol, I will refrain every time. So there's abuses on both sides of this conversation. There's legalism, which says alcohol consumption is always a sin for anyone at any time. And then, and a lot of times that can come from a good place because they've seen it abused. But that's one ditch. And the other ditch is licentiousness, which we have to also guard against. It says alcohol can be used however you want, and you will justify being controlled by alcohol, and it's an escape for you from this life. And so our hope is to avoid both ditches, okay? So again, just a sidebar, because of the culture we live in, I'm addressing that. That's not the main point of the story. And so let's get back to the story. John isn't telling us this story, regardless if you might think this, and sometimes this might be my tendency, is so that those of us who grew up Baptist and weren't allowed to drink would have some ammo against the people who taught us that growing up. That's not the main point of the text, and we're missing the point if that's what we do with the text. The main point, and I want you to get this, of this statement by the headmaster to the groom about this being the best wine is to prove that this was actual wine. Jesus performed a real miracle here where he took 150 gallons of water and in an instant turned it to real, very fine tasting wine. Simply by his thoughts or his words, we don't know exactly how he did it. But this would have been crazy. There was no time for the wine to ferment. There was no stomping of the grapes. There was no collecting the juice, none of the entire process that it would normally take someone to make wine. But now we've begun in this text to see Jesus as the Logos, the one who created life from nothing, who spoke it into existence in the beginning, the one through whom all things were created. And so if we've begun to know this Jesus and believe that he is who he says he is, we shouldn't be that shocked. And so in this story, we see Jesus as the one who creates good things for humans to enjoy. And I think this is important because in contrast to the common view that we have of Jesus, he was relaxed and he loved to eat and party with people, especially sinners. This is the Son of God who's on a mission to redeem the entire world, and he stops and accepts an invitation to go to a week-long feast where he's chilling and partying and hanging out. Jesus wasn't just this stoic dude who kind of sat in the corner and judged all the people who were out there on the dance floor having fun. Right? Like he probably got up and he probably danced and he probably sweated and he sang and he drank and he was merry because he had a good theology of celebration and partying. And our hope is that we as his people would be willing to bring the best as he did, and that we would share it with others as Jesus did, so that together we can enjoy God's good gifts as he provides them, so they can flow through us to the world around us. So that's one of the reasons I believe Jesus did this. But the main reason Jesus did this was to show his power and to begin to reveal his glory. Look at verses 11 and 12. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there only a few days. If you remember when we started this book, we learned that John wrote this book so that people would believe in the Son of God and have life in his name. And that is the point of this story, so that his disciples would see his glory, the ones who had just begun to follow him, and more fully believe in him. As much as I think this is a helpful story to dismantle ideas that we have about Jesus as someone who never laughed or smiled or partied, there is so much more going on. This story is drawing on thousands of years of history and pointing forward into the future to the work of Jesus as well. If you remember, we mentioned at the beginning of our time together today that there's always a reason behind the partying. And yes, in our story, there was the immediate reason of a wedding celebration. That was why they were there. But from the perspective of Jesus and from an eternal perspective, there was a much greater reason to party than just an earthly wedding. There was an eternal ceremony and a feast that was to come, and all of history had been building toward that moment, including the wedding we read about today. See, when we find our stories wrapped up in the greater story of Jesus, our earthly celebrations take on deeper meaning. And so we as Christians party on an even greater level than anyone in the world. See, one of the main themes in our story today was the theme of wine. Throughout the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, wine was this sign of prosperity and shalom and abundance. In Genesis 49, we're told that the story of God's people would finally be fulfilled, and when it was, that the wine would be so abundant that you would wash your clothes in it. Now, I know that sounds weird. The point here is not that you might actually wash your clothes in wine. The point is that wine, which was seen as rare, would be so abundant when Jesus is coronated as king that you could wash your clothes in it if you wanted to. It's just as common as water. It's the same thing we hear about when we read in Revelation that the streets are filled with gold and paved with gold. The point there is not that we're going to be like, oh my gosh, look at this gold. It's that what is rare to us now in light of eternity and in light of the glory of God is freaking pavement in the new creation. Like we're going to be stomping on it. That's how common it is. Like that's the point of what's going on with these prophecies. If you remember back in Amos, at the end of Amos chapter 9, we saw that when Jesus set up his kingdom, that the mountains would drip sweet wine and hills would flow with it. See, this story is drawing on all of this, and his disciples would have thought of this when they saw this sign. And it would have further caused them to believe that Jesus is here to bring the new creation. And it will be full of abundance and prosperity because Jesus is better than the old covenant. It's no accident that John mentioned these Jewish purification stone jars because that stood for the old covenant, and Jesus is fulfilling that and bringing something better. It's not ultimately about the wine or the gold or the good gifts. It's about the gift giver. It's about Jesus. The wine is just a sign pointing to the life that he brings. He's the prosperity. He's the life that we long for. That's why Jesus constantly says, true life is found in me. So this story not only draws on the imagery of wine, but it's not an accident that this happened at a wedding. It could have taken place anywhere, at any celebration, but Jesus inaugurates his signs by kicking it off at a wedding on purpose because he's creating a new covenant people. I want to go back and notice how John started our story today. Look at verse 1 again of chapter 2. On the third day, a wedding took place. Now, this is the only time in this gospel that John uses this expression on the third day, but this would have caught the attention of the readers of the gospel. Even pre-resurrection, which is where most of our minds will go, even before that, this would have caught their minds. This is why it's important for us to be students, not just of the New Testament, which is super important, but also of the Old Testament. The new covenant work of Jesus takes on deeper meaning when we know what he's doing. See, the third day had meaning for the people of God. It was on the third day that Abraham and Isaac saw God provide for them on Mount Moriah by providing a lamb in Genesis 22. It was on the third day when God promised in Hosea 6 to restore his fallen people. It was on the third day when Jonah, in a sense, came back to life out of the belly of the great fish that swallowed him in Jonah chapter 2. It was also on the third day of creation when Jesus created the vines of the earth that would produce wine. That's when they were created. This is a common theme. This is intentional wording from John here. The third day was also when God initiated his covenant, his marriage covenant with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. We've talked about this connection before. Moses told the nation of Israel, go consecrate yourself. And he said, be ready on the third day. Because on that day, God was going to show up and meet with his people at the base of Mount Sinai. This meeting has all the markings of an ancient Hebrew wedding ceremony. God is uniting himself to his people in a marriage ceremony. It's why throughout the Old Testament, we see Israel referred to as the wife or bride of God, and Yahweh was their husband. In Exodus 19, we're told multiple times that this happened on the third day. But I want you to notice something else. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 8 and 24:3, this is bookending this wedding ceremony between God and his people. Look at Exodus 19:8. It says, then all the people responded together, we will do all that the Lord has spoken. And then after the ceremony, in Exodus 24:3, Moses came and told the people all the commands of the Lord and all the ordinances. Then all the people responded with a single voice, we will do everything that the Lord has commanded. Does this language sound familiar? Do you remember what Mary told these servants when she told them to do whatever Jesus tells you to do? See, our story in John is drawing on a rich history of an epic story about a God who pursues his people as his bride. And even though they rebel and they cheat on him, and ultimately, even though they say they'll do whatever God says, they don't remain faithful, God still pursues them. And it's not an accident that John presents this story of a wedding right after he calls the first disciples to follow him. This is a new covenant people that God is creating. And it's not just made up of ethnic Israel, but of all peoples. And just like Jesus was brought forth through the lineage of Israel, so he's brought forth through his mother Mary, who in this story, she commands the servants to do the will of her son. This is what Israel had promised they would do, but they failed at it. But these servants obey, and the result is that abundant wine flows. See, the story today is about much more than just an earthly wedding ceremony where Jesus turns water into wine on the third day. This story is revealing Jesus as the true and faithful groom who himself is the reason for the party. And what is the will of the Father because of the work of Jesus now? To simply believe on the one who he has sent. See, Jesus is the one, the perfect Israel and the perfect servant who perfectly obeys the will of his Father, even unto death. And his blood shed to forgive our sins is the reason we still drink wine today every week at communion. Actually, juice so we don't offend people. But studying this text, I'm like, maybe we should have some of it be wine because it reminds us of the blood of Jesus that was shed for us. And he himself is the best gift. Jesus is the reason for the party. He's the reason we celebrate. And he showed us that with his life. See, the difference between the way Jesus parties and the world is not that he parties, but how he parties. See, at the parties of Jesus, everybody was invited. No matter their social status, no matter whether they could repay him or not. He told his disciples in Luke 14, when you host a banquet, invite those who are poor, maimed, lame, or blind, and you will be blessed. In our story today, it was the servants that got a glimpse into what Jesus was doing, not the important people. And so with his life, he shows us how to party. And in his death, we see that it wasn't all roses. Jesus didn't gloss over suffering or pain. That's not the type of celebration that this is. That just ignores it and says, be positive and see the glass half full. Like when Jesus said that his hour had not yet come, he knew that one day it would. He knew that the hour was going to come when on the cross he would shed his blood to redeem us, that he would pay the costly price that it took to win back his bride. And in doing so, he bore the wrath of God toward us, a rebellious, cheating bride, as we find ourselves whoring ourselves out to the world, thinking that we can find satisfaction and joy there. And he takes our place to ransom us. But he didn't stay dead. Like just like in our story today, when the party seemed to be over and Jesus shows up and keeps the party going, Jesus got back up out of the tomb and inaugurated the greatest celebration and party ever. This is ultimately when the glory of God would be revealed at its brightest. We get a glimpse of it in our story today, but we get the fullness of it in his resurrection. And this is better than good wine or the Super Bowl. Like the resurrection of Jesus is the reason to celebrate, a reason to keep the party going. And here's the thing, all of this right now in the here and now and the already not yet is just a foretaste and signpost. Every party is a shadow of the final party that's going to happen one day. When Jesus returns and shows back up and we all feast together at the greatest marriage reception ever, and there's going to be great food and beer and wine because Jesus is bringing it all and making it all, and it's going to be a blast, and we're going to have a party. Like we're going to dance. We're going to celebrate. We are going to smile in the new creation. We're not just, yes, thank you. We're not just going to sit on harps on clouds. Like we're going to get on the dance floor, right? And we probably won't even sweat there. So Chris, there you go. Sorry. Chris sweats a lot when he dances. I probably shouldn't say that from up here. But we're going to dance because evil has been conquered forever. This is why we party. I mean, we talk about this day a lot. Like Chris the other day was like, hey, we had a great conversation at the table. Our kids, we talked about the new creation. She's like, I don't know any kids that talk about the new creation. And I was like, yeah. And they always say like, they're like, yeah, we're going to get to be with God, but not Satan. He's evil and God's going to stomp him in the face. And I'm like, yes, let's celebrate because Jesus has risen and defeated death, hell, and the grave. We can have a healthy theology of celebration. We can enjoy good gifts that he's given us without abusing them because we know that the gift giver gave us himself. And so every good gift is just a signpost pointing to the gift giver. So they stay in their proper place. We don't need them to cope. We can enjoy them. See, as our story is wrapped up in the story of Jesus, we as his people begin to be formed or shaped by his story. As we see the glory of God on display in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and as we look in anticipation to his return, we actually become a celebratory people. And I don't mean people who fake it and pretend like everything's okay. Like we can actually throw the best parties because we have the best reason to throw a party. Jesus is alive. And so we eat, drink, and be merry, not to escape misery and because tomorrow we die, but because tomorrow in Christ, no matter what happens, we live. So we can celebrate. The way we party can be like Jesus. It can be different than the world. We don't abuse food or alcohol because we have the real gift. And we can invite everyone to this party, not just the people we like or the people that make us comfortable and look like us and talk like us and voted like us. We can invite everyone to come see the beauty of God on display. We invite the outcast, the forgotten, the ones who can't bring anything to the party because they can't afford it. Everyone is welcome at this feast. All you have to bring is yourself. And as we do this, our parties become foretaste of the final parties to come. And we can do this in tangible ways, like super practically. Our parties, our celebrations can actually take on sacred meanings when done this way. Like we don't think of parties as holy, right? right? This is holy. We come to the church, and be good and make sure we do what we do because it's a sacred place. Like your home, your party, wherever it is, can become a sacred place as it takes on meaning this way, as we invite everyone. When we celebrate marriage, we're celebrating not ultimately because of marriage, but because it points to Christ and his church. When we hold a baby shower, we know we're ultimately celebrating that spiritual sons and daughters are brought into the kingdom of God. When we watch the Super Bowl, we're reminded of the real victory that Jesus won in the cross and resurrection when he smashed Satan's face in the ground. And I know this is cheesy, but I'm not just Jesus juking you. Like everything actually points to Jesus. And it doesn't mean we ignore suffering. You guys know that we talk about lament and grief and pain here. We have to have a healthy theology of that. But here's the thing. Knowing that Jesus is risen gives us confidence that our suffering and pain is simply working to create a more glorious celebratory party in the long run. When Jesus comes back and he takes that suffering and he takes your ashes and he turns them to beauty in some way that only he can. As one author puts it, the longer the silent, the louder the chorus. So in our story today, we see that Jesus is here to bring a new covenant, to create a new covenant people, and this is reason to celebrate. And so my hope is that we at New Eden can be a people who throw the best parties because Jesus threw the best party for us. And may we invite any and all who will come because we were invited to the feast of Jesus, even though you were undeserving. And as we do this, our prayer is that others will be invited to see the glory and beauty of Jesus on display. If you don't know Jesus like this, if maybe you know Jesus is just this rigid person who never likes to have fun and will just ruin your life, he will wreck your life, but I promise you in the long run, it'll be for the better, and he will invite you and welcome you in and party with you and celebrate and shout with you when you're excited. Like that's the kind of Jesus we serve, and we invite you to surrender your life to him. And for those of us who have done that, we continue to invite others to see that glory on display, hoping that they'll join the party with us, singing and dancing till Jesus returns as the groom who will always bring the best wine to the party.